71 years old, Mildred Ashworth sat in the suffocating silence of the mahogany-paneled conference room at Miller & Reed Attorneys at Law, her deeply calloused hands resting on the edge of a table that cost more than her first tractor. For 44 years, those hands had balanced the pH of 35 acres of New England soil, distilled enough lavender oil to fill a small lake, and raised the two children, who are currently staring at her with the clinical indifference of creditors inspecting a bad debt. The family lawyer, Mr. Henderson, did not look up from the papers as he read the 2016 amendment, a document Mildred had signed while she was hospitalized with pneumonia, believing her husband Frank was protecting her future. Instead, the words falling into the room were a death sentence for her life as she knew it. The farm, the brand, and the historic farmhouse she had scrubbed on her hands and knees for 4 decades were gone, transferred entirely into the names of her son, Craig, and her daughter Jolene, leaving Mildred with nothing but the clothes on her back and a crushing sense of invisibility that made the very air in the room feel like lead. Craig checked his expensive silver watch with a sigh of practiced boredom, his face a mask of cold entitlement that made Mildred's blood run cold. He did not see a mother who had sacrificed her university education in 1975 to save his grandfather's failing legacy. He saw an obsolete piece of equipment that was taking up valuable real estate. "You should have worried about putting your name on the papers instead of playing with flowers all day, Mother," he said, his voice dripping with a patronizing tone that dismissed her botanical brilliance as a mere hobby. "This is a business, not a charity, and it is time for the professionals to take over." Beside him, Jolene did not even look up from her phone, her thumb scrolling through luxury real estate listings in Boston, as she casually mentioned that Mildred should be grateful they were letting her keep her personal savings of $1,870. They gave her 48 hours to vacate the only home she had known since 1976, offering her a manila envelope containing her birth certificate and a list of low-income senior facilities, as if they were doing her a kindness. The humiliation was a physical weight, a cold numbness spreading from Mildred's fingertips to her chest as she realized the children had used the profits from her own labor to pay the lawyers who had just stripped her of her soul. As Mildred stood with agonizing slowness, her vision blurring at the edges with a white heat she did not know she possessed, she clutched a single manila envelope against her linen shirt like a shield. She walked out of that office in a deafening silence, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a single tear or a jagged plea for mercy. To Craig and Jolene, she was a broken woman heading toward a quiet, forgotten end in some state-run hallway, but what they did not know was that the earth remembers what the people choose to forget. They had taken the land, the bank accounts, and the name, but they had left her the one thing they were too arrogant to understand: her 3 tattered leather-bound journals filled with the chemical secrets of the soil. What seemed like the final sunset over the Ashworth fields was, in reality, the first light of a fire that would eventually consume the very people who thought they had extinguished her. The world saw a penniless, 71-year-old widow with nowhere to go, but Mildred was already looking toward a rain-soaked flyer for an auction in a town called Havre, where an abandoned house for $2 held a secret that would turn her humiliation into a $1 million empire they could never touch. If you have ever felt like your years of silent dedication were invisible to the very people you loved most, you know the hollow ache that was burning in Mildred's chest that afternoon. If someone has ever made you believe that your age makes you obsolete, or that your deepest passions are nothing more than a hobby to be discarded, then you understand why she could not just give up. If you have ever wanted to show the world that a woman's power does not fade with time, but only grows deeper and more dangerous, like the roots of an ancient tree, then you are ready to see what happens next. Mildred Ashworth was about to prove that being thrown out with nothing is sometimes the only way to find everything. Stay with us to witness how a woman with $2 and a suitcase of old journals transformed a rotting ruin into a sanctuary of power that left her betrayers begging for a seat at her table. Subscribe now, because stories like Mildred's prove that the best chapters of your life do not start until you stop asking for permission to lead them and start listening to the strength that has been inside you all along. What she discovers beneath the floorboards of that $2 house in Havre, New Hampshire, is not just a hidden treasure, but a legacy of a forgotten woman that will give Mildred the tools to reclaim her dignity and build an empire that will make the Ashworth farm look like a child's garden. You will not want to miss a single moment of this journey, from the depths of betrayal to the peak of a pharmaceutical revolution that changed everything. Join our community today to ensure you see how Mildred turns the bitterest soil into the sweetest victory. Because, as she always says, the earth remembers what the people choose to forget. It all began in the sweltering heat of the 1975 Vermont State Fair, a place where the air tasted of fried dough and the promise of a future that seemed as vast as the green mountains on the horizon. Mildred was 21 years old then, a brilliant young woman with a mind for molecular structures and a heart full of dreams about a laboratory of her own. She was presenting a project on soil nutrients that caught everyone's eye, but it was Frank Ashworth who caught hers. He was a handsome young farmer, with a smile that promised partnership and eyes that seemed to see the genius behind her scientific charts. He told her they would be partners in everything, that her brilliance was exactly what his struggling family farm needed to survive the coming decade. She saw a man who needed her, and in her youthful idealism, she believed that love was a contract where both parties gave everything for a common goal. She did not know then that she was trading her degree in chemistry for a lifetime of uncredited labor, but the way he held her hand made the sacrifice feel like a beginning rather than an end. By the time they married in the spring of 1976, Mildred had already poured her small dowry into the farm's back taxes, a quiet gesture of devotion that she never expected to be repaid. She was 22 years old, and the ink on her marriage license was still fresh when she signed over her maternal grandfather's prized tractor collection to Frank's father, ensuring the Ashworth legacy would not be auctioned off to the highest bidder. It felt like an investment in their shared future, a foundation built on trust and the scent of damp New England earth. She moved into the historic farmhouse with 2 suitcases and a box of chemistry textbooks, believing she could still find a way to merge the lab with the land. But the farm was a hungry beast that demanded every waking hour, and slowly, the textbooks were pushed to the back of the closet to make room for canning jars and work boots. She did not mind at first because the dirt under her fingernails felt like honest work, and Frank was still the man who whispered that they were a team when the sun went down over the fields. The routine of sacrifice established itself early, a rhythmic drumbeat of labor that began at 4:30 every morning. While the rest of the world slept, Mildred was out in the fields, her boots soaking through with dew as she monitored the soil pH and irrigation across 35 acres of temperamental land. She learned the language of the lavender and the peppermint, understanding their needs with a precision that went far beyond mere gardening. She was a master of the earth, a scientist without a title who could tell the mineral content of a plot just by the way the soil crumbled between her fingers. Frank took over the public-facing side of the business, the charming face of the Ashworth brand, while Mildred became the invisible engine that kept it all running. She spent 12 hours a day in a non-ventilated drying shed, the air thick with the suffocatingly sweet scent of botanical resins that stained her hands a permanent, earthy yellow. It was grueling work that left her back aching and her lungs burning, but she told herself it was all for the family they were building. When Craig was born in 1979, Mildred's world shifted, but her workload only doubled. She would carry the infant in a sling while she distilled the oils, the rhythmic thumping of the machinery acting as a mechanical lullaby for the boy who would one day treat her like an intruder. She was no longer Mildred the scientist. She was becoming Millie the mother, a transition that Frank encouraged with subtle, patronizing praise. By the 10th year of their marriage, Frank had stopped consulting her on the major sales, moving his base of operations into a climate-controlled office, while she remained in the dirt. He started referring to her botanical formulations as her little hobby when guests visited, a phrase that felt like a needle under her skin, but one she chose to ignore for the sake of peace. She was the one who managed the seasonal staff of 15 people, ensuring every bottle of oil was perfect, but when the local newspapers came to do a story on the farm, Frank was the only one in the photograph, standing tall and clean against the backdrop of her labor. The arrival of Jolene a few years later only deepened the domestic fog that was settling over Mildred's identity. She was the woman who never missed a school meeting, the one who cooked every meal and passed every shirt, all while ensuring the lavender crop was the most potent in the tri-state area. She was the roots of the tree, invisible and underground, holding everything together while the rest of the family enjoyed the fruit. Jolene grew up watching her father treat Mildred like a high-functioning employee, a lesson the girl learned all too well. While Mildred was scrubbing floors and distilling oils, Jolene was dreaming of a boutique lifestyle in Boston, looking at her mother's calloused hands with a mixture of pity and disdain. The girl never understood that the luxury she craved was paid for by the very resins that stained her mother's skin. By the time Mildred reached her 50th birthday, her name had completely disappeared from the company brochures, replaced by a generic history of the Ashworth men who had supposedly built the empire from nothing. The erosion of her authority happened in small, quiet increments that Mildred mistake for the natural progression of a long marriage. She noticed Frank having secret meetings with the family lawyer, Mr. Henderson, as early as 2016, but when she asked about them, he told her he was simply simplifying the estate for her protection. She was recovering from a severe bout of pneumonia at the time, her body weakened by decades of labor, and she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the man she had sacrificed her degree for was finally looking out for her. She did not see the way Craig, now an arrogant man obsessed with cost-cutting, watched those meetings with a hungry look in his eyes. She did not see the way Jolene looked at the historic farmhouse as if it were a cluttered obstacle to a profitable sale. Mildred was too busy focused on a blight that was threatening the crop, her scientific mind working overtime to save the farm one more time, unaware that her children were already measuring the rooms for a life that did not include her. There were signs she should have seen, seeds of betrayal planted in the shadows of the drying shed. She remembered finding a stack of legal documents hidden in Frank's desk during the final year of his life. But she had closed the drawer without reading them, her heart refusing to acknowledge the possibility of a treachery so deep. She chose to trust the man she had loved for 44 years, even as he became more distant and secretive. He died of pancreatic cancer in March, leaving a vacuum of power that Craig and Jolene were all too eager to fill. Mildred spent those final weeks nursing him with a devotion that left her hollow, believing that her place on the farm was as secure as the stones in the foundation. She thought that the Ashworth name was hers as much as it was theirs, a shared legacy of sweat and science. She did not realize that to her children, she was just an obsolete piece of equipment, a rusted tool that had served its purpose and was now ready for the scrapyard. The humiliation of the lawyer's office was not an isolated event. It was the final note in a symphony of dismissal that had been playing for decades. As she looked back on those years of silent dedication, Mildred realized that she had been the one to teach them how to ignore her. She had been so busy making sure everyone else was fed, clothed, and successful that she had forgotten to put her own name on the deeds of her life. She had built $1 million brand with her chemistry and her calluses, but she had done it under a name that did not belong to her. The children had used the very profits she generated to pay the lawyers who would eventually strip her of her soul, a poetic cruelty that made her blood run cold in the silence of her empty bedroom. She was 71 years old, penniless and discarded, but as she packed her 3 tattered leather journals into her old Subaru, she felt a burning heat in her chest that was not despair. It was the realization that while they had taken the land, they had forgotten to take the mind that made the land valuable. Even in the darkest hours of her final night at the farmhouse, sleeping on a bare mattress while Jolene put sell stickers on the antique furniture, Mildred found herself thinking of a town called Haver. She had seen a flyer at a rest stop, a rain-soaked piece of paper for a delinquent tax auction that felt like a beckoning ghost. People in the valley whispered that the soil in Haver was poisoned, that nothing had grown there since a woman named Eugenia Hale died 60 years ago. But Mildred knew that the earth remembers what the people choose to forget, and she had spent 44 years learning how to listen to the secrets of the dirt. She did not know what was waiting for her 2.5 hours north, but she knew it could not be worse than the cold indifference of the children she had raised. The foundation of her life had turned to sand, but as she drove away from the Ashworth fields for the last time, she realized that a woman who knows how to build an empire once can certainly do it again, even if she has to start with nothing but a $2 ruin and a heart full of fire. The heavy silence of the conference room was broken only by the rhythmic, indifferent tapping of Jolene's manicured fingernails against the screen of her smartphone. She didn't look up as Mr. Henderson slid a thick stack of papers across the mahogany table, her eyes fixed on a gallery of high-end Boston condominiums instead of the mother who had spent 44 years ensuring her daughter never knew a day of want. Mildred stared at the document titled Voluntary Relocation Agreement, a phrase so sanitized and clinical it felt like a slap across her weathered face. The air in the room seemed to thin, turning cold and metallic as the realization settled in her bones that this wasn't just a legal meeting, it was an execution of her entire identity. Craig leaned back in his leather chair, his silver watch catching the light as he checked the time with the impatient air of a man waiting for a slow waiter. He didn't see the woman who had stayed up through 1,000 winter nights to save the harvest. He saw a line item that needed to be deleted to balance the sheet. The casual cruelty of their posture, the way they occupied the space as if she were already a ghost, sent a shiver of pure, icy indignation through Mildred's chest that made her breath hitch in her throat. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, a dry, papery sound that signaled the beginning of the end, and began to detail the specifics of the 2016 amendment. Mildred closed her eyes for a brief second, the date hitting her like a physical blow to the stomach. That was the year she had been hospitalized with a pneumonia so severe the doctors had whispered about last rites in the hallway. She remembered Frank bringing papers to her bedside, his voice a soothing murmur about protecting her, about making sure she would never have to worry about the farm if he were gone. She had signed them with a trembling hand, her lungs burning with every breath, trusting the man she had loved since the Vermont State Fair in 1975. Now she realized that while she was fighting for her life, her husband and children were systematically erasing her name from the history of the earth. The betrayal was so precise, so calculated, that it felt like a surgical strike against her soul, performed by the very people she would have died to protect. She looked at Craig, hoping to see a flicker of shame, but found only the flat, predatory gaze of a businessman closing a deal on a failing subsidiary. The humiliation deepened when Craig finally spoke, his voice dripping with a patronizing tone that made the calluses on Mildred's hands feel like badges of shame rather than honor. He explained with the slow deliberation one uses for a confused child that the farm title was now 100% in his and Jolene's names, and that the Ashworth Lavender brand had been restructured to exclude her as a signatory. You see, Mother, the overhead of your traditional methods is simply unsustainable in a modern market, he said, smoothing his silk tie with a gesture of immense self-importance. We've hired a firm from New York to handle the chemical synthetics that will replace the oil distillation. It's for your own good, really. You've worked so hard, and it's time for the professionals to take over the heavy lifting. The word professionals hung in the air like a poisonous fog, dismissing her decades of scientific mastery and soil chemistry as if she had been nothing more than a hobbyist playing in the dirt. He didn't mention that the very profits she had generated through those traditional methods were currently paying for the expensive lawyer sitting at the head of the table. Jolene finally looked up from her phone, her face carefully composed into a mask of performative sympathy that was more insulting than a scream. She reached out as if to touch Mildred's hand, but pulled back at the last second, her eyes lingering on the yellow stains of botanical resins that marked her mother's skin. Honestly, Mum, you should be grateful we're letting you keep your personal savings of $1,870, she said, her voice light and airy as if she were discussing the weather. It's more than enough to get you settled into one of those lovely senior communities near Brattleboro. They have organized bingo and gardening clubs where you can plant all the little flowers you want, without the stress of $1 million inventory hanging over your head. The suggestion of a low-income senior facility, a place of beige hallways and forgotten lives, felt like a cage closing around Mildred's future. She realized then that to Jolene, she was just an unsightly piece of clutter that didn't fit the aesthetic of a high-end luxury brand, a faded photograph that needed to be tucked away in a dark drawer so the new owners could shine. As the meeting dragged on, the layers of cruelty were empiled with a systematic efficiency that left Mildred reeling. Mr. Henderson informed her that all business bank accounts had been frozen as of that morning, and that her access to the farm's credit lines had been revoked. She was being given exactly 48 hours to vacate the farmhouse, a home she had scrubbed, painted, and maintained since the bicentennial summer of 1976. Craig mentioned that he had already scheduled a cleaning crew to come in on Monday morning to clear out the junk, a term he used to describe her life's collection of research, seeds, and family history. "You can keep those old, stained journals of yours," he added, gesturing toward the tattered leather book she held against her chest like a shield. "Nobody can read your chicken scratch anyway. And they're certainly of no use to the laboratory we're setting up in the city." The mockery of her intellect, the dismissal of the formulas that had built their fortune, was the final spark that turned the cold numbness in her chest into a white-hot coal of silent, focused rage. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that filled the room as the children waited for her to break. They wanted a scene, a jagged plea for mercy, or a tearful display of weakness that would justify their decision to treat her as an incompetent relic. But Mildred Ashworth did not give them the satisfaction. She sat with her spine as straight as a fence post, her eyes fixed on a point on the wall just above Mr. Henderson's head, refusing to let them see the way her heart was shattering into a million sharp pieces. She felt the eyes of the junior paralegal on her, a young woman who looked away in a mixture of pity and embarrassment. But Mildred did not look down. She gathered the single manila envelope containing her birth certificate and her meager check, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were handling a fragile chemical compound. The indignity of being paid $1,800 for 44 years of labor was a debt she knew the universe would eventually collect, even if her children believed they had escaped the bill. Walking out of that office was the hardest thing Mildred had ever done, her legs feeling like they were made of lead, and her vision blurring at the edges with a strange, shimmering heat. She passed through the reception area where the staff looked down at their desks, the news of her eviction likely already whispered through the building like a wildfire. The sunlight outside was too bright, too indifferent to the fact that her world had just ended on a piece of signed parchment. She drove the 1998 Subaru back to the farm in a daze, her mind replaying the image of Craig checking his watch over and over again. When she arrived, the sight of the lavender fields shimmering in the afternoon breeze felt like a betrayal of their own. These were her children too, the plants she had nurtured from seeds, and now they belonged to people who only saw them as percentages on a spreadsheet. The air smelled of the coming harvest, a scent that had always brought her peace, but now tasted like ash in the back of her throat. The final 48 hours were a blur of micro-cruelties that stripped away whatever remained of her dignity. She found Craig in the distillery shed the next morning, a contractor by his side, as he pointed toward her custom-made glass stills. "We'll tear all this old copper out," he was saying, his voice booming in the space where she had spent 10,000 hours perfecting the art of the essence. "It's inefficient and dangerous. We'll put in a modern tasting room here with a bar and some reclaimed wood tables." He didn't even look at her as she walked past to gather her small wooden box of hand tools. Later that afternoon, she watched from the kitchen window as Jolene walked through the garden with a roll of neon orange cell stickers, slapping them onto the antique oak table that had belonged to Mildred's grandmother and the hand-carved rocking chair where she had nursed both children. Jolene didn't ask if she wanted to take anything. She simply assumed that a woman headed for a state-run facility wouldn't have room for memories. On the final evening, Mildred stood in the mudroom, her suitcase packed and her 3 leather journals tucked into a crate on the passenger seat of her car. She heard Jolene's voice coming from the living room, a sharp, cold sound as she spoke to a friend on her cell phone. "Honestly, it's a relief to finally have her out of here," Jolene said, her laughter echoing through the house Mildred had built. She was becoming such a burden, always smelling like dirt and complaining about the soil. "We're going to list the house for $2.2 million once the renovations are done. It's finally an Ashworth property again, without the peasant aesthetic." The words peasant aesthetic stung like a hornet, a final dismissal of the dignity of labor from a woman who had never known the weight of a shovel. Mildred didn't stay to hear the rest. She walked out to the Subaru, her boots crunching on the gravel she had laid herself, and didn't look back, even as the porch light flickered and died behind her. She drove until the sun began to dip below the horizon, the weight of the silence in the car almost as heavy as the silence in the lawyer's office. At a rest stop on Route 9, she sat in the flickering light of a buzzing neon sign, her hands shaking so hard she had to grip the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She was 71 years old, homeless, and possessed less than $2,000 to her name. The terrifying image of a cold, sterile nursing home bed flashed through her mind, a vision of her final years spent as a nameless number in a government ledger. But then, her eyes fell on the bulletin board near the vending machines, where a rain-soaked flyer for a delinquent tax auction in a town called Harver was flapping in the wind. The house for $2 seemed like a cruel joke at first, a mirror of her own worth in the eyes of her children. But as she stared at the blurred photograph of the grey ghost building, she felt a strange, vibrating recognition in her chest. The drive toward Harver was a descent into a darker, colder New England, the lush lavender fields of her past giving way to the jagged granite and skeletal trees of the north. Every mile she traveled was a mile away from the woman who had sacrificed everything for a family that didn't exist, and a mile closer to a version of herself she hadn't seen since the 1975 fair. She realized that by taking everything, Craig and Jolene had inadvertently given her back her freedom. They had removed the burden of being the roots, and in doing so, they had allowed her to become the seed once again. The earth in Harver might be poisoned, and the house might be a ruin, but it was a ruin that no Ashworth could claim. As she crossed the town line, the air turning 5 degrees colder, Mildred whispered her catchphrase into the empty car, a vow to the ancestors and the soil that had never lied to her. The earth remembers what the people choose to forget, and the children were about to learn that you should never bury a woman who knows exactly how to grow in the dark. The 2.5-hour drive north from Brattleboro felt like descending into a different century, where the lush, manicured rows of the Ashworth lavender fields were replaced by the jagged, unforgiving granite of the New Hampshire border. Mildred gripped the steering wheel of her 1998 Subaru with knuckles that remained a stark, bloodless white, her eyes fixed on the winding road as the late afternoon sun cast long skeletal shadows across the asphalt. The air grew 5 degrees colder with every 20 miles she traveled, the scent of expensive fertilizer and diesel fumes fading into the sharp primeval smell of wild pine and damp granite. She was 71 years old, and for the first time since 1976, she was traveling toward a destination that did not have her husband's name on the mailbox. Every rhythmic thump of her tires over the cracked pavement seemed to echo the word discarded, a hollow sound that vibrated through her seat and into her very bones. She had $35 in her pocket and a single manila envelope on the passenger seat, a pitiful inventory for a woman who had just been erased from $1 million legacy by the children she had nursed and protected. The jagged mountains rose up around her like silent, indifferent judges, offering no comfort to a widow who had traded her scientific brilliance for a handful of ash and a cold, empty car. When she finally turned onto Blackwood Lane, the gravel crunched under her tires with a sound like breaking teeth, leading her toward the grey ghost of a building that was now her only sanctuary. The Federalist-style farmhouse at number 142 sat hunched at the end of a driveway, choked with invasive bittersweet and the skeletal remains of dead elms, its once proud frame built in 1840, now sagging under the weight of 60 years of absolute neglect. The porch had partially collapsed into a tangle of rotted wood and grey dust, and the windows were boarded with sheets of plywood that had turned a sickly mossy green from decades of rain. The only sound in the suffocating silence was the rhythmic metallic thumping of a loose shutter against the grey cedar siding, a lonely heartbeat that seemed to beckon her closer. Mildred stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting her lungs with a sharp, medicinal sting that made her cough, the scent of ancient dust and damp earth rising from the overgrown yard to meet her. She stood there for a long moment, a wiry woman in faded denim, looking at the ruin she had bought for exactly $2, wondering if the town had sold her a house or a tomb. The house did not look like a home, it looked like a warning, a physical manifestation of the obsolescence her son Craig had described with such clinical precision back in that mahogany conference room. She walked toward the front door, with a heavy rusted crowbar she had found in her grandmother's old wooden toolbox, her 71-year-old joints protesting every step over the uneven, root-tangled ground. The wood of the door was swollen and grey, resisting her first few attempts to pry it open, but Mildred leaned her weight into the tool with a silent, focused desperation that ignored the ache in her lower back. When the wood finally groaned and splintered, giving way with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty woods, a wave of stale, frozen air rushed out to meet her, smelling of mouse droppings, wet plaster, and the ghost of a lavender scent that should not have been there. She stepped into the darkness of the hallway, her flashlight beam cutting through a forest of cobwebs that hung from the ceiling like tattered silk curtains. The floorboards creaked under her boots, a hollow, echoing sound that made the house feel cavernous and predatory in the fading light. She found a small space in what might have once been a parlor, the walls stripped of wallpaper and the plaster crumbling onto the floor in white, chalky piles. There was no heat, no water, and the electricity had been cut off before she was even born, leaving her alone with the deepening shadows of a New Hampshire evening. She was a master of the soil and a scientist of the leaf, but in this cold, lightless void, she felt like a child lost in a forest with no path back to the warmth. She returned to the Subaru to retrieve her 3 tattered leather journals and the wool blanket her grandmother had woven in 1945, her movements slow and deliberate as she tried to conserve the little energy she had left. She sat on the edge of the open trunk, the interior light of the car, the only beacon in a world that had turned a deep, bruised purple as the sun vanished behind the ridge. She opened her checkbook to stare at the balance of $1,870, the total value of 44 years of labor, a number that seemed to mock her from the white page. This was the cost of her trust, the price of believing that a partnership of the heart was protected by the laws of the land. She thought of the 35 acres of lavender she had left behind, the climate-controlled offices where her children were likely celebrating their victory with expensive wine, and the contrast felt like a physical weight on her chest. They had the millions, the title, and the legacy, while she had a $2 ruin on a street called Blackwood, and a trunk full of memories that no one else could read. The invisibility she had felt in the lawyer's office was now a vast, crushing reality, a silence so absolute that she could hear the blood rushing in her ears like a distant, angry tide. She was a ghost living in a ghost house, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, she wondered if it would have been easier to simply disappear into the shadows of the woods and let the earth reclaim what her family had discarded. The night brought a cold that was more than just a drop in temperature. It was a hungry, invasive force that seeped through the glass of the car windows and settled into her marrow. Mildred wrapped the wool blanket around her shoulders, huddling in the back of the Subaru because the house felt too heavy with the weight of Eugenia Hale's forgotten life to enter after dark. The wind began to howl through the empty rooms of the farmhouse, a high, mournful sound that mimicked the jagged sobs she had been holding back since the meeting in Brattleboro. When the first tear finally fell, it was not a quiet trickle, but a violent, racking release that shook her thin frame until her throat was raw and her eyes burned with a salt heat. She cried for the 22-year-old girl who had dropped out of university in 1975 to save a man's farm, and for the 50-year-old woman who had ignored the secret meetings because she was too busy saving a crop from blight. She cried for the humiliation of being told she was a burden by the daughter she had carried in a sling through the drying sheds, and for the cold indifference of the son who had called her scientific brilliance a mere hobby. The fear of dying alone in a state-run hallway, a nameless number in a beige ledger, rose up in the darkness like a physical monster, threatening to swallow her whole. She was 71 years old and she was terrified. The stoicism of her life finally shattering into 1,000 sharp pieces that cut into her soul in the lonely silence of the New Hampshire night. Sleep was a fractured, shallow thing, interrupted by the rhythmic thumping of the loose shutter and the terrifying realization that she did not know how she would survive the next 72 hours. She lay there in the cramped space of the car, her breath blooming in white clouds against the ceiling, thinking of the 2016 amendment that had turned her into a trespasser in her own home. The physical pain of the cold was a distraction from the mental spiraling, the way her mind kept replaying Craig's voice calling her dear in that patronizing tone that made her skin crawl. She realized that she had spent 4 decades building a fortress for people who were more than happy to lock her out of the gates as soon as the keys were in their hands. The betrayal was not just a legal maneuver, it was a total rejection of the value of her existence, a declaration that her calloused hands and her botanical mind were no longer of use to the modern world. She felt the weight of her age as a sentence of death, a heavy blanket of grey that obscured any path toward a future. The silence of Hava was different from the silence of the farm. It was a heavy, judgmental silence that seemed to ask her why she had bothered to come here at all. By 3 in the morning, her tears had dried into salty tracks on her cheeks, leaving her with a hollow, vibrating exhaustion that felt like the end of everything she had ever known or loved. The first light of dawn hit the grey ghost house at exactly 6:15, a pale, watery gold that filtered through the skeletal trees and caught the frost on the Subaru's windows in a million shimmering diamonds. Mildred sat up with a groan of pure physical agony, her joints stiff from the cold and her eyes swollen from the night of grief. But as she looked at the house in the morning light, something shifted. The sun revealed the intricate carvings on the Federalist trim, details that had been hidden by the shadows of the previous evening, and she realized that the structure, though neglected, possessed a dignity that even 60 years of abandonment could not erase. She stepped out into the crisp morning air, her boots crunching on the frost-covered weeds, and noticed a strange, vibrant patch of green near the collapsed porch that should not have been there in this climate. She knelt down, her calloused fingers reaching out to touch the leaves, and her scientific mind began to override the despair of the night. It was a rare variety of St. John's wort, larger and more potent than anything she had seen in Vermont, thriving in the very soil that the town rumors said was poisoned by an old tannery. The earth was speaking to her in a language of resilience, showing her that life could not only survive in the shadows of rot, but could actually become something stronger because of it. She walked further into the 3-acre lot, her eyes scanning the ground with the precision of a master gardener, identifying plant after plant that seemed to defy the local legends of toxic dirt. She found wild valerian, ancient elderberry bushes heavy with the promise of future fruit, and a carpet of wintergreen that released a sharp, medicinal scent when her boots brushed against it. The soil under her fingernails was dark, rich, and possessed a complex mineral smell that reminded her of the hidden laboratory she had once dreamed of building in 1975. The realization that the poisoned soil rumor was likely a lie felt like a spark in the center of her chest, a small glowing ember of the fire she thought her children had extinguished for good. She was not just a discarded widow. She was a woman standing on a gold mine of botanical potential that no one else in the valley was smart enough to recognize. The house was a ruin, yes, and her bank account was a pittance, but the land was alive and it was waiting for someone who knew how to listen to its secrets. She thought of Eugenia Hale, the woman they called a witch, because she understood the healing power of the earth, and she felt a sudden, vibrating connection to the legacy that was buried beneath the bittersweet vines. Mildred was not going to a senior facility. She was going to work, and for the first time in 44 years, the name on the results would be hers and hers alone. She grabbed the heavy wooden box of her grandmother's hand tools and her rusted crowbar, walking back to the front door with a stride that was no longer hesitant or broken by the weight of betrayal. She began to pry the rotting plywood from the first-floor windows, the screech of the nails coming loose sounding like a defiant scream against the silence of Blackwood Lane. With every board that fell to the ground, more light flooded into the grey ghost house, revealing the sturdy oak floors and the high, elegant ceilings that were just waiting for a new life. She did not have $1 million laboratory yet, but she had a gallon of vinegar, a box of rags, and a mind that could calculate molecular weight in her sleep. She spent the next 4 hours scrubbing the ancient dust from the kitchen counters, her movements a rhythmic, focused meditation that pushed the voices of Craig and Jolene into a dark corner of her mind. She was not just cleaning a house, she was reclaiming the space of her own existence, 1 inch of mahogany at a time. The physical labor was a familiar comfort, a language she spoke better than the legal jargon of Mr. Henderson, and by noon, the first window was clear enough to let the New Hampshire sun reach the center of the room. She was 71 years old, and she was starting from zero. But as she looked at her reflection in the clean glass, She saw the eyes of the scientist she had once been, ready to turn the bitterest soil into a victory they could never touch. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor, Mildred heard a sound that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up in a primal, warning reflex. It was not the rhythmic thumping of the loose shutter or the wind in the pines, but the distinct, heavy crunch of footsteps on the gravel driveway outside. She gripped the handle of her grandmother's heavy steel garden trowel, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird as she moved toward the window she had just cleaned. Through the glass, she saw a man standing near her Subaru, a tall figure in a worn canvas coat with a thermos in one hand and a heavy-duty bolt cutter in the other. He was not a young man, and he did not look like a process server or a representative from a senior facility. He looked like someone who belonged to the jagged granite and the wild pine of the north. Mildred felt a surge of her familiar prickly suspicion, the defensive armor she had built over 44 years of being told she was invisible as she prepared to defend the $2 ruin that was now her entire world. The man looked up at the house, his eyes settling on the window where she stood, and for a long, vibrating second, the silence of Hava felt like a held breath. Before she could find her voice to tell him she did not need any charity, he spoke with a gravelly, calm resonance that seemed to echo the very foundations of the earth itself. "That house has a way of biting back if you do not ask it permission first," he said, and Mildred realized that her isolation was over before she had even had a chance to name it. Mildred spent the third morning on her hands and knees in the narrow, windowless pantry, the air thick with the sharp, acidic scent of white vinegar and decades of undisturbed lime dust. She was scrubbing the floorboards with a rhythmic, punishing intensity that served as a distraction from the cold hunger gnawing at her stomach and the lingering echo of the voice of Craig calling her a burden. The wood was old-growth oak, darkened by time, and a mysterious layer of what felt like dried resin, requiring her to lean the full weight of her 71-year-old frame into every stroke of the brush. As she reached the far corner near the heavy, built-in flour bin, the brush snagged on a jagged edge of wood that sat nearly half an inch higher than the surrounding planks. She paused, her breath hitching in the silence, and ran her calloused fingertips along the seam, feeling a strange, hollow vibration beneath the surface that made the hair on her arms stand up in a primal reflex of curiosity. This was not a natural warping of the timber from moisture or age. It was a deliberate surgical alignment of boards that had been designed to look unremarkable to a casual observer, but felt like a secret to a woman who had spent 44 years studying the architecture of the earth. She retrieved the heavy steel crowbar from the toolbox of her grandmother, her heart hammering against her ribs with a cadence that matched the distant rhythmic thumping of the loose shutter outside. The wood groaned and splintered as she forced the edge of the tool into the narrow gap, the sound echoing through the empty farmhouse like a gunshot in a canyon. With a final, violent heave that sent a sharp pain through her lower back, the three central planks gave way, flipping over to reveal not the expected floor joists and dirt, but a smooth grey slab of hand-poured concrete that had been meticulously leveled. There was a small iron ring recessed into the center of the slab, covered in a thick, protective layer of hardened beeswax that had preserved the metal from the dampness of the New Hampshire soil for over 60 years. Mildred knelt on the dusty floor, her fingers trembling as she picked at the wax, revealing the cold, heavy weight of a handle that felt as though it had been waiting specifically for her touch. She took a deep breath, the scent of ancient stone and hidden history filling her lungs, and pulled with a strength born of decades of hauling lavender crates, the concrete lid sliding back with a grinding screech that signaled the end of her life as a discarded victim. Beneath the slab lay a concrete vault, barely 2 feet square but packed with a precision that bordered on the sacred. Inside, nestled in individual pockets of rotted silk and dry cedar shavings, were 26 hand-blown amber glass jars, each roughly 16 ounces, and sealed with thick, overlapping layers of dark beeswax. Mildred reached out to lift the first one, the glass feeling impossibly cold and heavy in her palm, its surface rippling with the beautiful imperfections of mid-century craftsmanship. When she held it up to the pale light filtering in from the kitchen, the liquid inside did not look like oil. It looked like captured sunlight, an iridescent gold that shimmered with a viscous, living energy. The labels were written in an elegant, fading cursive that had survived the passage of 60 years in the darkness, each bearing a date ranging from 1943 to 1961, and a single, cryptic number. She recognized the scent immediately as it seeped through the wax seal, a hyper-concentrated essence of wild arnica and high-altitude valerian, processed with a purity that the modern steam distiller back at the Ashworth farm could never have achieved. This was not a collection of home remedies. This was a pharmaceutical treasure, the life work of a woman who had discovered the molecular secrets of the valley long before Mildred was even born. As she carefully moved the jars to the kitchen counter, her scientific mind began to race with the implications of what she was holding in her stained, calloused hands. She knew the market value of stabilized organic concentrates better than any corporate cost-cutter in a silk tie. Tom Beckett, the retired pharmacist from down the road, would later confirm through his rudimentary lab equipment that these were pharmaceutical-grade anti-inflammatories of such potency that they could revolutionize the treatment of chronic skin conditions. Just one of these vials, specifically the one labeled Concentrate Number 14, contained a stabilized peptide structure that Mildred realized was the missing link in her own lavender formulations. The secret to making essential oils that did not just provide a scent, but actually triggered cellular regeneration. In the cold light of the Haver morning, she realized that she was holding at least $500,000 in patent rights alone, a fortune hidden beneath a $2 floor in a house the world had left to rot. The humiliation of the $1,800 check in her purse suddenly felt like a distant, insignificant mosquito bite compared to the thundering realization that the earth had just handed her the keys to an empire that would make the Ashworth farm look like a child window box. Beneath the last row of amber jars, she found a small leather-bound diary, its cover cracked and worn to the texture of a dried leaf. Mildred sat on the floor. The cold of the concrete seeped into her bones unnoticed as she opened the first page to find the name Eugenia Hale written in the same elegant script as the jars. It was a chronicle of a woman who had been silenced by the very men who sought to profit from her knowledge, a mirror of the life of Mildred that made her throat tighten with a jagged, sudden grief. She read through entries detailing the 1950s, when local developers had tried to institutionalize Eugenia to seize the land, and how she had spent her final years hiding her research in the hope that another woman of the earth would one day find it. The final entry, dated August 14, 1961, was written with a trembling hand that felt like it was reaching across time to grab Mildred by the shoulders. To the woman who finds this, "They called me mad because I listened to the earth instead of the men in suits. I leave my life to you. Do not let them take your bloom." The words were a direct strike to the heart of Mildred, a validation of her existence that her own children had never provided in 47 years of motherhood. She was not a burden or a hobbyist. She was the successor to a lineage of power that the Ashworths were too arrogant to even imagine. Tucked into the back of the diary were several yellowed, folded sheets of parchment that Mildred carefully smoothed out on the kitchen table, her eyes widening as she realized they were original land surveys and legal deeds from 1950. She saw the familiar boundaries of her 3-acre lot, but as she traced the lines with a shaking finger, she noticed a discrepancy that made her blood run cold, with a new kind of indignity. The documents proved that the Hale estate actually included an additional 10 acres of prime, wild-growth forest that bordered the New Hampshire State Park, land that the town and the banks had conveniently forgotten in the 60 years of abandonment. More importantly, she found a series of letters between a local bank president and a tannery owner, revealing that the rumor of the poisoned soil had been a calculated lie started in 1962 to depress the property value so they could eventually buy it for pennies on the dollar. The soil was not toxic. It was actually some of the most mineral-rich earth in the Northern Corridor, protected from modern pollutants by the very legends that kept people away. She owned 13 acres of the most valuable botanical real estate in the Northeast, and she had bought it for $2 because she was the only person smart enough to look past the gray cedar siding and the boarded windows. The most devastating revelation, however, was a handwritten chemical blueprint labeled the triple extraction method. As Mildred stared at the complex molecular diagrams and the temperature-specific cooling cycles Eugenia had perfected, she felt the final piece of her own scientific puzzle click into place with a physical jolt. This was the process she had been trying to intuit for 20 years in the non-ventilated sheds of the Ashworth farm, a way to stabilize botanical resins without using the harsh chemical solvents that Craig was currently trying to implement in Brattleboro. It was a clean, revolutionary science that combined traditional New England herbalism with a level of molecular precision that would make the most advanced laboratories in Boston look obsolete. With these formulas and the Hale concentrates, Mildred realized she did not just have a new product, she had the ability to destroy the very brand her children had stolen from her. The Ashworth lavender line would look like scented water compared to the healing power of what she could now create in this ruined kitchen. She was not just a mother who had been discarded. She was a biochemical botanist who had just been given the ultimate weapon of reconstruction. And for the first time in 44 years, the name on the patent would be hers and hers alone. By the time Tom Beckett returned to the house that afternoon, bringing with him a heavy-duty generator and a collection of glass beakers from his own basement, Mildred was a different woman. The stoic resignation that had carried her across the New Hampshire border had been replaced by a vibrating, predatory focus that Tom recognized immediately. He watched as she laid out the amber jars on the clean mahogany counter, her hands moving with a fluid, scientific grace that ignored the ache in her joints. When she showed him the diary and the land surveys, the retired pharmacist sat in the silence of the kitchen for a long time, his eyes moving from the iridescent violet liquids to the weathered face of the woman who had found them. "You realize what this is, Mildred," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp of pure awe. "This is not just a discovery. It is a restoration of justice. The town thinks this place is a tomb, but you have just found the heartbeat of the whole valley." He offered her his partnership not out of pity, but out of a profound respect for the mind he saw working behind her silver hair. They spent the next 6 hours cross-referencing the notes of Eugenia with the own journals of Mildred, the two of them working in a rhythmic silence that felt like the beginning of a revolution fueled by vinegar, light, and 60 years of hidden truth. As the first month of their partnership began, the $1,800 that Jolene had called more than enough was transformed into the seed money for a small used steam distiller that Tom helped her haul into the old barn. Mildred spent 16 hours a day clearing the bittersweet vines from the hidden 10 acres, her boots sinking into the rich, dark soil that smelled of minerals and ancient life. She began to harvest the wild St. John's wort and the valerian, using the triple extraction method of Eugenia to create the first prototype of what would become the Hale and Ashworth Healing Serum. The physical labor was grueling, leaving her back bruised and her hands raw, but every time she felt the urge to stop, she thought of the cell stickers Jolene had slapped onto the table of her grandmother. She was not just growing flowers, she was growing a defense. The community of Havre began to take notice of the gray ghost house as the navy blue paint began to cover the weathered siding and the collapsed porch was replaced with sturdy New Hampshire pine. The neighbors who had whispered about the witch of Blackwood Lane now saw a wiry, silver-haired woman who worked with a ferocity that made them stop their trucks to watch, sensing that something powerful was waking up in the shadows of the dead elms. By the end of the 4th month, the first batch of the serum was complete, a deep, iridescent gold liquid that possessed a scent so pure it seemed to vibrate in the air. Mildred held the first small glass vial to the light of the setting sun, her reflection in the glass no longer that of a discarded widow, but of a woman who had successfully turned the bitterest betrayal into a tangible medicinal victory. She felt the weight of the discovery not as a burden, but as a foundation as solid as the granite beneath her feet. The earth had remembered what her children had chosen to forget, and the legacy of Eugenia Hale had found its rightful heir in a woman who knew exactly how to grow in the dark. As she labeled the first crate for the independent pharmacies in the valley, Mildred realized that the revelation was not just about the money or the patents or the land. It was the realization that her worth had never been tied to the Ashworth name or the deeds of a farm in Vermont. Her power was in her mind, in her calloused hands, and in the seeds of a future that were now blooming with a fire that no one would ever be able to extinguish again. The $2 ruin had become a sanctuary of power, and the world was about to learn that you should never underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose, and the entire earth on her side. Tom proved to be the anchor Mildred did not know she needed, his deep knowledge of the local soil chemistry complementing her own mastery of botanical formulation with a seamless, quiet efficiency. Together, they navigated the complex legal filings required to register the Hale and Ashworth patents, a process that Mildred funded by selling just 3 of the 26 concentrates to a specialized dermatological research lab in Hanover. The resulting check for $75,000 felt like a physical shield against the poverty that had threatened to swallow her just weeks prior, allowing her to purchase the high-grade equipment necessary to scale the triple extraction method. They worked late into the nights, the glow of the laboratory beakers reflecting in the windows of the Blue House as the community of Haver began to shift its perception of the old Hale place. Local farmers started bringing their own heritage seeds to Mildred, sensing that she possessed a wisdom that surpassed the modern chemical-heavy methods of the industrial giants. She was no longer an outsider. She was becoming the centerpiece of a local botanical revival, a woman who had turned a graveyard of elms into a nursery of hope for an entire valley that had been forgotten by the modern world. By the time the first frost of autumn kissed the New Hampshire hills, the transformation of the $2 ruin was nearly complete, but the most powerful change was the one reflected in the mirror of the navy blue hallway. Mildred stood on her new porch, the wood solid and fragrant beneath her boots, watching as the morning mist rolled off the 10 acres of wild-growth forest that were now legally hers. She held a copy of the cease and desist order that the lawyer cousin of Tom had prepared, a document that would soon land on the desk of Craig in Brattleboro like a lightning strike. She knew that the Ashworth lavender brand was failing, its synthetic formulas causing the very skin rashes that her new serum was designed to cure with a single application. The dynamic of power had inverted so completely that she could feel the weight of it in her chest, not as a burden, but as a sharp, cold clarity of purpose. She was not waiting for her children to call or for a senior facility to open its doors. She was waiting for the moment they would realize their mistake, and she was armed with the truth of the earth and the genius of a woman they had tried to bury. The revelation was finished, the weapons were forged, and Mildred Ashworth was finally ready to step out of the shadows and reclaim the name that had always truly belonged to her. 8 months had passed since Mildred Ashworth first stood before the grey ghost of 142 Blackwood Lane with a rusted crowbar and a heart full of ash. The transformation of the property was not merely a renovation, it was a resurrection of a forgotten era, meticulously executed by a woman who had finally reclaimed her own narrative. The sagging porch had been replaced with sturdy aromatic New Hampshire pine, and the weathered cedar siding was now a deep defiant navy blue that stood out against the green ridge like a beacon of intent. The 3 acres of invasive bittersweet were gone, replaced by the structured elegance of the Hale and Ashworth Healing Garden, where gravel paths meandered through rows of rare medicinal herbs that pulsed with a vibrant, unnatural health. A high-grade steam distiller hummed with a low, rhythmic vibration inside the renovated barn, and a discreet sign near the gate, made of brushed copper, simply read, "Sold out for the season." Mildred stood on the top step, her linen shirt crisp and her silver hair catching the morning light, looking less like a discarded widow and more like the sovereign of a small but impenetrable kingdom of science and soil. The silence of the valley was interrupted by the distinct, high-pitched hum of a luxury engine, a sound that felt as intrusive as a scream in a library. A silver Mercedes-Benz, its underside splattered with the very New Hampshire mud that Craig had always viewed with such disdain, turned into the driveway with a hesitant, jerky motion. Mildred did not move as she watched her children step out of the vehicle, their expensive leather shoes sinking into the fine grey gravel she had laid with her own hands. Craig looked around with a bewildered, predatory confusion, his eyes darting from the pristine laboratory barn to the lush rows of medicinal plants, his mind likely struggling to reconcile this thriving estate with the image of the state-run hallway he had envisioned for her. Jolene followed, her oversized sunglasses reflecting the navy blue house she had once dismissed as a ruin, her posture stiff with the realization that the woman standing on the porch was no longer a burden to be managed. They walked toward the house with the practiced, false confidence of people who believed that their presence was still a gift, unaware that the rules of the Ashworth name had been rewritten the moment Mildred crossed the town line. Craig stopped at the base of the steps, his face a mask of performative concern that did not quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Mother, we have been worried sick about you living out here in the middle of nowhere," he said, his voice carrying that same patronizing tone he had used in the Brattleboro conference room. "We heard about your little botanical venture, and we thought it was only right that we come up here to discuss merging your new brand back into the family company. It is a business necessity, really, to protect your interests and ensure that the Ashworth legacy remains unified under professional management." He spoke as if he were offering her a lifeline, oblivious to the fact that his own empire was currently bleeding out from a massive product recall in Vermont. Jolene stepped forward, her face twisted into a tight, manipulative smile of sympathy that Mildred had seen 1,000 times before. "Honestly, Mom, look at all this work you are doing at 71, she added, her voice light and airy. "It is just too much for a woman your age. Let us take the stress off your shoulders so you can finally enjoy the retirement we always wanted for you in a proper facility." Mildred looked down at them, her expression as unyielding as the granite foundation beneath her boots, the silence between them stretching until Craig began to shift uncomfortably in his silk suit. "You did not want the woman who played with flowers when she was scrubbing your floors and saving your harvests. So why exactly do you want her flowers now?" she asked, her voice low and precise, carrying a weight that made Jolene flinch. "The Ashworth name belongs to the farm you are currently running into the ground, with your cheap synthetics and your cost-cutting shortcuts. But this ground belongs to me and the legacy of a woman you were too arrogant to ever acknowledge." She did not raise her voice, but every word was a surgical strike against the entitlement that had defined their lives. "I am not a mother to you today," she continued, her eyes fixed on Craig with a clinical indifference that mirrored his own from 8 months ago. "I am a competitor, and according to the latest market reports from the independent pharmacies in the tri-state area, I am the one who is winning." The shock on their faces was a physical thing, a jagged realization that the power dynamic had not just shifted, it had completely inverted. Before Craig could find his voice to threaten a lawsuit, Mildred reached into the pocket of her denim overalls and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper, sliding it across the railing with a steady hand. "This is a cease and desist order prepared by a legal team that understands exactly what intellectual property means," she said, her tone as dry as old parchment. "It forbids the Ashworth Lavender Company from using any of the formulas, extraction methods, or chemical blueprints contained in the journals you called chicken scratch. We have already proven in court that those research notes were my private property prior to the 2016 restructuring, and every synthetic batch you have produced in the last 6 months is a direct violation of the patents I now hold under the Hale and Ashworth name. If you so much as mention my name or my methods in your marketing again, the bank will not be the only ones coming for your assets." The document was the final nail in the coffin of their arrogance, a physical manifestation of the fact that the professional management they had boasted about was nothing more than an empty shell without her scientific mind to fill it. Jolene began to cry, but the tears were the same performative weapons she had used since childhood to get her way, and this time they fell on stone. "This is so unfair," she sobbed, her voice high and desperate as she looked at the navy blue house she could no longer claim. "We are your family, Mother. You cannot just cut us out like this after everything we have been through together." Craig's face turned a mottled, angry red, his hands balling into fists as he realized that his silver Mercedes was one of the few assets he had left that had not been leveraged to the hilt. "You think you are so smart," he hissed, his voice thin and vibrating with a frantic, impotent rage. "You are an old woman in a dead town, and you will regret the day you turned your back on your own son." Mildred simply stepped back and closed the heavy oak door in their faces, the sound of the deadbolt clicking into place, echoing through the hallway, with a finality that signaled the end of 44 years of silent dedication. She watched through the clean glass of the window as they retreated to their car, their movements jerky and small against the vast, indifferent beauty of the New Hampshire ridge, The poetic justice that followed was as systematic and mechanical as the extraction method Mildred had perfected in her barn. Craig had tried to replace the natural, labor-intensive oils of his mother with cheap synthetic fragrances sourced from an industrial supplier to maximize the profit margins he so dearly loved. Within weeks, the Ashworth Lavender brand was hit with a tidal wave of consumer complaints as customers across New England developed severe chemical rashes and allergic reactions to the new formula. A massive product recall was ordered by the health authorities, leading to a $500,000 class action lawsuit that shattered the already fragile finances of the farm. The very cost-cutting measures he had used to justify his mother's eviction became the noose that strangled his career, and because he had leveraged the land to fund his lavish lifestyle, the bank moved with cold efficiency to seize the 35 acres. Craig Ashworth, the man who saw his mother as an obsolete tool, found himself standing in a foreclosed field, bankrupt and hollowed out by the very greed he had called professional excellence. Jolene suffered a different, more social kind of erosion that was perfectly calibrated to her vanity. She had used her share of the farm's projected profits to purchase a luxury condominium in the most exclusive district of Boston, believing that her association with the high-end Ashworth brand made her untouchable. When the recall hit the news and the scandal broke, her firm fired her for reputational damage, unwilling to be linked to a family synonymous with toxic products and the elder abuse of a local legend. The luxury condo was repossessed by the lenders, and the social circle that had once clamored for her attention vanished like mist in the morning sun. She was forced to take a job as a junior clerk in a suburban real estate office, spending her days filing papers for the very small, unremarkable lives she had once mocked her mother for leading. The irony was absolute. The woman who wanted to fund a boutique lifestyle by discarding her mother ended up in a beige cubicle, finally understanding the weight of the invisibility she had tried to impose on the woman who had given her everything throughout her entire life. They had tried to steal $1 million farm, but ended up with nothing because they failed to realize that the value was never in the soil or the deeds or the historic farmhouse. The value was in the woman they had underestimated, the biochemical botanist who could turn a $2 ruin into a pharmaceutical empire while they were busy measuring the rooms for a life they did not earn. Mildred had built her new kingdom on the foundations of truth and science, while her children had built their house of cards on the shifting sands of manipulation and arrogance. The Ashworth name was now a stain in the valley of Vermont, a cautionary tale of greed, while the name of Hale and Ashworth was a symbol of healing and resilience across the entire Northeast. The reversal was not just financial, it was a total restoration of the moral order of the earth. As the silver Mercedes disappeared down the road, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust behind, the victory of Mildred was a silent, thundering fact that would be remembered by the mountains long after the names of her children were forgotten. Mildred walked out to the porch swing where Tom was waiting with 2 glasses of iced peppermint tea, the scent of the evening lavender rising from the garden to greet her like an old friend. She sat down, her 71-year-old body finally allowing the tension of the last 8 months to drain away into the sturdy New Hampshire pine. She did not feel the white-hot rage of the auction or the cold numbness of the lawyer's office. She felt a profound, weightless peace that was as deep as the roots of the ancient elms. As the sun began to set behind the ridge, painting the sky in shades of iridescent violet that matched the liquids in the jars of Eugenia, Mildred let out a single jagged sob that was not born of grief or fear. It was a sob of pure, unadulterated triumph, a release of the 44 years of silence she had endured for a family that never deserved her brilliance. She leaned her head against the shoulder of the man who had seen her power when no one else would, and in the deepening shadows of Havre, she finally closed her eyes and listened to the earth breathing in the silence of her own home. 2 years have passed since the silver Mercedes turned back toward the valley of Vermont, leaving a cloud of dust and a shattered legacy in its wake. At 73 years old, Mildred Ashworth no longer measures her days by the demands of others, but by the rhythmic sunrise over the 13 acres of the Hale and Ashworth Botanical Estate. The grey ghost house has fully surrendered its shadows to a vibrant restoration of navy blue and crisp white trim, where the windows now sparkle with the clarity of a woman who has nothing left to hide. Every morning begins in the quiet sanctuary of her new laboratory, which she built inside the old oak barn, using the very patents that her children once called chicken scratch. She moves between the stainless steel cooling cycles and the glass beakers with a fluid, scientific grace, her calloused hands now a symbol of authority rather than a badge of shame. The air is thick with the iridescent scent of the triple extraction serum, a fragrance that has become the gold standard for healing in the most prestigious clinics across the Northeast. She is the architect of her own peace, standing at the center of a $1 million empire that was built one grain of soil and one molecular blueprint at a time. The community of Havre no longer speaks of the Witch of Blackwood Lane, but of the woman who brought the valley back to life. Mildred has established the Eugenia Hale Scholarship for Women in Chemistry at the State University, ensuring that no brilliant mind in this valley will ever have to drop out to save a man who does not appreciate her worth. Every autumn she hosts a group of young apprentices, including Sarah, who now manages the heirloom seed bank that was nearly lost to the trash heap of the Ashworth farm. Tom Beckett remains by her side, his presence a steady and silent foundation, as they sit on the porch swing in the evenings listening to the wind in the healthy pines. They do not talk of the past or the betrayals, but of the new soil samples and the way the wild valerian is blooming in the hidden 10 acres. There is a quiet, late-life romance between them, a partnership of equals that is rooted in mutual respect and the shared knowledge of the earth. Mildred has realized that she did not just save a historic Federalist house from rot, but she saved the scientist she was always meant to be before the world told her to be invisible. There is no path back to the farm in Vermont, and Mildred has ensured the boundaries are as solid as the stone walls of New Hampshire. She has not spoken to Craig since the day she shut the door in his face, but she hears through the town grapevines that he is still working through the bankruptcy proceedings of the failed Ashworth brand. For Jolene, there is a different kind of connection, a choice made from a position of strength and quiet pity. Every Christmas, Mildred sends a check for exactly $500 to the suburban real estate office, where her daughter now works as a junior clerk. There is always a short handwritten note attached that simply says, "For your savings," a mirror of the words Jolene once used to dismiss her mother in the lawyer office. Mildred does not seek an apology or a tearful reconciliation, because she knows that some betrayals are too deep for words to mend. She provides for her daughter from a distance as a reminder of the wealth she built alone, but she never allows the toxicity of that past life to cross the threshold of her navy blue home. She has learned that you can forgive a debt without ever allowing the debtor back into your vault. On a warm afternoon in late July, Mildred stands at the entrance of her property, touching the bronze plaque she had commissioned for the gate. It bears the names of Hale and Ashworth and a small engraving of a lavender sprig intertwined with a laboratory beaker. As she runs her fingers over the cool metal, she thinks of the 1975 Vermont State Fair and the girl who thought love was a contract of sacrifice. She realizes now that the greatest discovery she found beneath the floorboards was not the amber jars or the secret formulas, but the evidence that she was never truly alone in her struggle. She has become the guardian of a legacy that honors every woman who was told her passions were just hobbies, and every worker who was treated like an obsolete tool. Her reflection in the bronze is that of a woman who is finally whole, a survivor, who turned a $2 ruin into a sanctuary of power. She whispers her final wisdom to the wind, knowing that a woman is worth far more than the names on a deed, and that her power is found in the seeds she carries in her soul. The earth has remembered what the people chose to forget, and Mildred Ashworth is finally home. My heart overflows with gratitude for you having stayed with Mildred in every moment of this journey, from the depths of betrayal to the peak of her silent triumph. If this story has touched a place in your soul, if you have ever felt like your years of sacrifice were invisible to the very people you loved most, then you know why this victory matters so much. If you have ever been told that you are too old to start over, or that your deepest passions are nothing more than a hobby to be discarded, then let Mildred be your proof that the best chapters of your life do not start until you stop asking for permission to lead them. We tell these stories because we believe that no one should ever have to carry the weight of invisibility alone, and that every calloused hand has a masterpiece waiting to be built. Your presence here is part of a community that values the wisdom of the years and the strength of the resilient heart, and we are honored to have you at our table. Please leave a single word in the comments below describing the feeling of watching an invisible woman finally find her light and reclaim her power. Your interaction helps us reach more people who might be sitting in their own shadows right now, needing to hear that the end is actually just a beginning in disguise. This story teaches us that justice is not a coincidence, but a harvest of truth. It reminds us that a woman who knows how to grow in the dark can never be truly buried by the greed of others. It proves that the value of your mind is independent of the names on your mailbox, and that the earth will always provide a place for those who know how to listen to its secrets. May you remember that your worth is not found in the opinions of those who did not plant the garden, and that your bloom is a fire that no one else has the right to extinguish. Share this story with someone today who needs to remember that their years of dedication were not in vain, and that a new foundation can be built even from the ruins of a $2 house. Let them know that it is never too late to pick up the crowbar and pry back the boards that have been hiding their brilliance from the world. Every share is a seed planted in the mind of someone who might be losing hope, and your voice is the water that helps those seeds grow into a future of autonomy and strength. We will continue to bring you these journeys of resilience and poetic justice, because the world needs to see that the roots of a woman are the strongest force on this earth. Join us again for our next story of transformation and courage as we explore the hidden treasures that are waiting to be found in the most unlikely places. Thank you for your time, your heart, and your dedication to the truth. The earth remembers what the people choose to forget.